right, thank you for being here. I'm Kevin Johnson, Dean of UC Davis School of Law, and we're continuing our Racial Justice Speaker Series. It's been ongoing for several years. We initiated the series after the horrible events in Minnesota where George Floyd was killed, and also Breonna Taylor in Tennessee was killed. And we wanted to start a robust discussion of issues of race in the United States. And we focused not just on policing, but on various kinds of discrimination and racism that affect things like voting, immigration, corporate governance, and the like. We've also tried to spend some time talking about not only African Americans, who of course are subject to systemic racism in our society, but other groups as well, including Asian Americans, Latinos, Muslims, and others. So we've really worked hard to have a broad focus in talking about racism in the United States. And when we added this series, we decided that it was a good time because people were starting to talk about systemic racism in U.S. society. And some people, including like our speaker today, Professor Haynes, has been talking about systemic racism for decades. And it's nice if you're an academic who's been thinking and writing about these things to have society start to realize that they're in fact a real issue in your society. We're lucky today to have Professor Bruce Haynes of our sociology department on campus, who will talk today about Between Race and Religion, Reflection on Jews, Race, and Anti-Semitism. Professor Haynes has been at UC Davis for quite a while. He was born in Harlem, New York, received his BA in sociology from Manhattanville College. He later taught at Yale, and he came to UC Davis in 2001, where he's now a full professor in sociology. His most recent book with NYU Press is entitled The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. And it won the 2019 Albert Rabateau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. Please welcome Professor Bruce Haynes.
Thank you so much, Dean Johnson, for inviting me to speak here today at the law school. I actually think this might be the third time I've had the pleasure of being here at the law school. The last couple of times I actually spoke about my first mentor, a gentleman by the name of Jay Schulman, who founded the National Jury Project and who basically encouraged me to go to graduate school. And under his tutelage, I did some jury selection in New York State for 3 or 4 years before I went to graduate school. So last time I was here, I was talking about doing jury selection and working on some high publicity cases like Howard Beach and Bensonhurst, which were some civil rights cases that took place in New York. Today, however, I'm going to draw from my research on Jews of African descent in the US. And when the dean asked me to come, I thought to myself, wow, how will I talk to the law school about this topic of Jews of African descent, and what could I say to you that would have any use to you whatsoever? So what came to mind was thinking about Whoopi Goldberg. If you remember back in January 2022, Whoopi declared on ABC's The View that the Holocaust was not about race, but was about white-on-white violence and man's inhumanity to man. And if you remember, her words created quite a widespread commendation. It drew commendation, it drew commentary, especially from Jews. And I wanted to talk about her words a little bit because they tend to reflect how many Americans have come to understand race in America and how we think that race is really about color. And although color has always been a signifier of racial difference in the United States, I believe it is a grave mistake to conflate color with race. Here in the United States, for example, people from places like Pakistan or Suriname or Southern India or the South Pacific, who may have dark skin, often darker than, say, folks of African descent, African Americans, but these folks are rarely mistaken for Black people. And so we know that, in a practical sense, we know that color is not race and is not really treated as race in America. But Whoopi's comments also reveal to us not only how Americans tend to think about race and color as synonymous, but also how the presumption of Jewish whiteness can actually overshadow important racial dimensions of anti-Semitism. This emphasis on color often leads people to overemphasize the Black-white binary and overlook what I refer to as the racialization of Jews in Western society. So if we go back to Europe, back during the Middle Ages, and we'd understand, if we look at the work on that, on the Jewish body that we have come to draw from scholars, that we've come to see that Jews were seen as a distinct group, an inferior and distinct race, and that idea was widespread and was emerging in the early modern era. The anti-religious trope of Jewish deicide, that Jews are collectively responsible for the death of the Christian Messiah Jesus, intertwined with rumors of secret Jewish rituals that require the blood of Christian children. Jews, like witches, in fact, were associated with menstruation and blood, and were said to be spiritually polluted, possibly even cannibals, who were ruled by Saturn and took on a melancholic influence from Saturn as evidence of their commission of maleficum. So this blood libel forms a sacrilege alongside the murder and cannibalistic sacrifice of Christian babies. Both were attributed to Jews and to witches. So those ideas influenced thinking during the 1700s of scientists like the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus and the French zoologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who came to see social differentiation through the lens of race. So for Lamarck, Jews were considered a historic race, a group that was transformed by time, by environment. They were considered both to be heterogeneous and at the same time an amalgamated group, but a group that lacked the racial purity of so-called natural races like Negroes and whites. So from the era of the Christian-dominated Middle Ages through the period of the Enlightenment, Jews had been widely seen as an alien race and presence among a Volkish identity that was emerging within white Christian states in Europe. And we can follow the logic of this race thinking from the early modern era through the 18th century, all the way through scientific racism and eugenics movement of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and trace them right up to the early theories of race amongst the Nazis. So since the 17th century, both Europeans and Americans influenced one another in the scientific discourse and political dialogue about race and racial difference. But politically, it was the United States that took the lead in using race as a basis for determining rights and citizenship. By the 1740s, Christian baptism no longer protected Africans from slave status, and miscegenation laws emerged as a way to ensure racial distinctions between Africans and Europeans. Color indeed was used as a major signifier of racial difference, but color was not race. And in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, that point is made absolutely clear. Not only did Plessy v. Ferguson solidify Jim Crow segregation at the late 19th century, separating folks by this notion of separate but equal doctrine, but the courts also quantified racial dissent by ruling that despite his 7/8 white ancestry, i.e. Homer Plessy was only 1/8 Black, that Homer Plessy was still considered to be a, quote, colored race under US law. So this logic of racial ancestry, this very logic that the Nazis would reproduce in their own Nuremberg laws which we now understand were modeled after our own segregation and miscegenation laws. But here in the United States, When Sephardic Jews arrived back in New Amsterdam from Brazil in 1654, Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch Director General of the colony, recognized the whiteness of these swarthy Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal. Despite their widespread acceptance in the courts as white, though, historically Jews have often continued to function as a group and sought to maintain a sense of community. And thus the courts have come to navigate that boundary. But because the First Amendment speaks of an establishment of religion and free exercise thereof, and because Jews have historically been classified as white by the US, they have overwhelmingly been treated by the courts as religious group. And Jews have been recognized by the courts in the areas of employment practice and education in particular. For example, Jews have negotiated the right to observe Jewish holidays and to therefore be excused from school or work. And rabbis have been given the power over issues like religious marriage contracts and kashrut or kosher food guidelines. But in treating Jews as a religious group, the courts have historically ignored the racial dimensions of anti-Semitism, which tend to remain hidden behind this taken for granted white status. But I was drawing attention kind of recently to the 1982 Supreme Court case in Shahar Tefillah Congregation versus Cobb, where Jews made a race-based claim that their Maryland synagogue had been the target of racially based anti-Semitic graffiti. The synagogue leaders and their lawyers took the provocative position that because the perpetrators were motivated by the belief that the Jews that they attacked were in fact a distinct race from white folks, and that the court should consider these motivations as racial under the law. And in fact, the Supreme Court agreed. And I'll read the court's finding. The court said, "We agree with petitioners. However, that the Court of Appeals erred in holding that Jews cannot state a 1982 claim against other white defendants. That view rests on the notion that because Jews today are not thought to be members of a separate race, they cannot make out a claim of racial discrimination within the meaning of 1982. That construction of the section we have today, rejected in St. Francis College versus Al-Ghazari, our opinion in that case observed that definitions of race when 1982 was passed were not the same as they are today, and concluded that section was, quote, intended to protect from discrimination identifiable classes of persons who are subjected to intentional discrimination solely because of their ancestry or ethnic characteristics. As St. Francis makes clear, the question before the court is not whether Jews are considered to be a separate race by today's standards, but whether at the time 1982 was adopted, Jews constitute a group of people that Congress intended to protect. It is evident from the legislative history of the section viewed in St. Francis, a review that we not repeat here, that both Jews and Arabs were among the peoples then considered to be distinct races and hence within the protection of the statute. Jews are not foreclosed from stating a cause of action against other members of what today is considered to be a part of the so-called Caucasian race. Thus, the judgment of the Court of Appeals, therefore, is reversed and the case is remanded for further proceedings. So what I found very interesting about this case is while the court did not assert that Jews were non-white, the court did set a new precedent that seemed to recognize the racial dimensions of anti-Semitic behavior. The racial dimensions of anti-Semitism is further complicated, however, by what is the changing demographics of today's Jewish community. And so if we look at the surveys done since the 1990s, American Jews who self-identify as non-white have been steadily increasing. Immigration from the global South, cross-racial adoptions, intermarriage, as well as growth in the multiracial population have all contributed to steady demographic transformation of American Jews. 2013 Pew Research Center survey reported that 6% of roughly 5.3 million Jews in America self-identify as non-white. The latest survey by Pew conducted in 2020 identified 8% of self-identified Jews And they also found 15% amongst Jews ages 18 to 25. So amongst the younger cohort of Jews, we see larger numbers of people who self-identify as non-white. Right here at UC Davis, the UC student body, 18% of the UC Davis Jewish community has self-identified on a recent survey as non-white. In today's Los Angeles County, 20% of Jews identify as either Mizrahi or Sephardic, and so they're not recognized as being of European ancestry. And another 6% self-identify as Jews of color. Thus, this historic presumption that Jewish whiteness or that Jews are white may no longer hold true. Now, given these changing demographics and identity claims and the rising tides of both racism and anti-Semitism, I guess I put it to you, because I'm not the lawyers, you guys are, if the changing demographics will have any significant impact in the way people will petition the courts in the future, in the way these intersectional identities of non-white Jews and Jewish identity become intertwined. Thanks for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Anyone wants to pose a question, please feel free.
But I love talking about this topic because the presumption that Jews are white is so taken for granted. As soon as I tell people the Jews are non-white, people have a hard time even framing questions sometimes. But yes.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I'm curious if there are other examples where our assumptions about racialization and groups are inept, similar to Jews and whiteness. Are there other examples?
Well, Dean Johnson just conveyed to me a little story about his own daughter, where presumptions about identity is made based on physical looks. And of course, you couldn't tell very much about my ancestry from my physical looks. And so I think the notion that we know what a Christian looks like, or what a Buddhist looks like, or what a Jew looks like, I think is rapidly being brought into question. Thanks for that question. Yes, Barry.
Yeah, I was just advertised there's an event tonight at 8 o'clock in Keith Hall where the student group is sponsoring diversity in Israel, where people of color in Israel are the majority. They're not white. They're Sephardic Jews, they're Ashkenazi Jews, they're all people, very, very different racial backgrounds, if you want to use the word racial. So you're welcome to come see that yourselves, and there'll be a lot of people there who will amplify what Bruce is talking about.
And just kind of as you sort of stumble through those categories, that's exactly what people are facing right now is, well, how do you count these differences? Do you divide people by Sephardic and Mizrahi? Do you use traditional racial classifications? Do you use both? And so right now, there is a demographic mess afoot as scholars debate how best to identify non-white Jews.
Yes. Could you perhaps briefly define what those different groups are? So like Sephardic, for instance, if we haven't heard about what that.
Okay, so Sephardic generally means Jews who are descended from Spain and Portugal. Mizrahi generally means Jews who are from Northern Africa and the Arab world. And Ashkenazi usually means Jews who are from Central Europe. But those are very broad categories. One very interesting scholar, David DeVar, has written an award-winning book about the history of Sephardic Jews. And he actually argues in his book that the whole notion of Ashkenazim is an attempt for European Jews to claim descent from Europe. And the connection to the notion of the Sephardim is also a connection to, is in dialogue with that same conversation of Jewish whiteness that the Ashkenazim terminology is engaged with. And so that's a kind of novel way of thinking about those categories, but it suggests that even those categories might prove problematic in terms of references to boundaries within Judaism that are not in some ways tied to whiteness.
It sounds as if, and I agree with it, that sort of the process of societies creating racism or creating racialization have a huge impact on and the classification and characterization of Jewish people, just like it does African Americans, Latinos, and other groups. We often think of, wrongly, I think, we often think of race as something biologically based. And really, it's something socially constructed. Can you talk about how the process of racialization influences your whole approach to this?
Thank you. That's a great question. Indeed, I think what makes my work novel is I looked at the question of how did the idea of race shape the contact between Africans and Jews in the New World. And what I came to see is rich dialogue about race that engaged both Jews and Blacks. That at times Jews were made into Blacks and Blacks were made into Jews. That's part of the conversation. Tudor Parford has a great book about that. And there is a historic conversation where I began to understand that part of the challenge for Jews in the modern world was trying not to be raced as being racially different. And so in my book, I argued that Jewish intellectuals in the late 19th century articulated a kind of framework of cultural pluralism that said that they could be two things at once, an ethnic, being Jewish and American. And that hyphenated framework allowed them to claim whiteness. And by doing so, avoided being trapped behind the wall of Jim Crow segregation. And so essentially, I argue that Jews were deeply in dialogue with the color line and in trying to avoid it. And that gives a different perspective on why, following the Springfield riots in 1908, Northern Jewish intellectuals called on Du Bois to found the NAACP, in part because this was a period of rabid racism, rabid anti-Semitism, rabid eugenics, and Jews were fearful for their own status in a world that was drawing rigid racial boundaries. And as you see, just 20 years later, that narrative gets played out in Nazi Germany as the Nazis copy American race law to racialize Jews. One of the challenges I think today is in the politics of post-war environment where the narrative is that Jews have become white and that Israel has become a settler colonial state. The conversation about Jews and whiteness get conflated with conversations about Israel and politics. And I think part of what I'm pushing is for us to reconcile sort of these past 70 years of Jewish whiteness in America with the 700 years of racial persecution that Jews have experienced through racial frameworks in the West. Yes.
Professor, if you were sitting at that table with Whoopi Goldberg, and just the two of you, how would you have responded to her comment? If she said, well, what do you think of that?
I would have said, Whoopi, back in 1954, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a really interesting piece in a journal called the New Left Review after returning from visiting Warsaw. And in that piece, he said, up until this point, I thought racism was about color prejudice. And then he referred to that as being a provincial view and that he was now enlightened by what he understood in Warsaw. I think there was a rich conversation amongst progressive intellectuals following the war, where they understood that the relationship between totalitarianism and racism were very close. And I think that conversation has gone away, and we no longer see racism as tied to state building. We see racism as somehow free-floating something about color. And it's way more than color. It's about a ascriptive status that removes a person from being subject to civil treatment. And in that context, we see parallels all across the world that certainly transcend the question of color. Yes.
Can you help define some of these terms when we talk about race? You also mentioned ethnic groups. And so how do you look at ethnicity and how do you look at race?
So I think if we look at the history of the concept of ethnicity, it emerges out of a rich political discourse and social science discourse, particularly with regards to the Chicago School. And so the notion of ethnicity historically was only applied to European groups. Nobody else got to be ethnic until a sort of contemporary conversation of ethnicity has emerged. So I would argue that ethnicity has historically been used as a framework to signify who's included within this sort of generic white family of Europe. And that's historically the way we have used it up until rather recently. And it's in that context that I saw this role of Jewish intellectuals framing this particular take on how they could become real Americans within a very long historical discourse that said Jews could not become part of states. And that was the long history. That was the Jewish question of Europe. Right? Were Jews their own group, or could they really become part of contemporary modern states? And that's the question Jews face in contemporary Germany. And in some ways, that's the question Black Americans face in contemporary America. Yes.
So looking at the distinctions between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, like how far back do we need to look historically to understand how those distinctions break down? Because it's like
Great question.
graphic definitions of a group defined by diaspora.
So when I first started this research as a sociologist, the first thing I thought is, I don't know who Jews are. So I'm going to go into the record books and trace this term Jews, and you don't get very far. You barely get past the 19th century, because there are other terms that are used to refer to Jews, not the term Jewish. And so that in and of itself, and so there's some interesting scholarship on the notion of the invention of the concept of Jewishness as a somewhat of a modern idea in the first place. And so right from the very beginning of my project, I realized, oh, it's a moving target, kind of like trying to figure out who Black people are. And then you have the same historical question. If you go back in historical record and you try to look, well, who are the Europeans say are the Black people? You realize that there's this crazy conversation going on about culture, about color, about who they're discovering when they run into Africans. And it's not a linear conversation. It's a hodgepodge conversation. And so right from the beginning, I realized, well, what is it I'm tracking? And I had to come up with what it was I was looking at. So I was looking at a particular manifestation of Judaism in the modern world. I was looking at rabbinic Judaism, right? And one could talk about other groups who might be descended from Jews, who may say that they're Jews as well, but that's different from those that have this particular rabbinic tradition. So again, it got really complicated just even figuring out who the hell I was talking about in the beginning. Who are the Blacks and who are the Jews, and how do you talk about these groups without reifying the terminology that they're using? And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how not to reify race while I showed the social construction of race across 500 years. And that's what I attempt to do in my book. You can tell me how successful I was. Yes.
So my understanding was, just correct me if I'm wrong, that for census data, some of it is longitudinal, and they found that the same people over the course of a decade might actually change their racial self-identification on the census.
No, but there is research that does speak to that question, but that's not what I was saying. I was more saying that the numbers of people in sample surveys are growing.
Got it. So I guess my question was then, for the Pew study that you're talking about, which I think is not longitudinal,
Correct.
what is your perception of how much the shift from 2013 to 22 has been about the elastic maybe definition of non-whites within?
Well, that's a good question. The first surveys to actually have a race question was in 1990. And that was the first national survey. And they found 132,000 people who self-identified as Jewish and Black. And the scholars didn't believe that there could be that many. This is just not possible. There must be Sephardic Jews who are checking the black box. And I said, I don't think so. And so those numbers have slowly grown across the decades. We see them really picking up over the last 20 years as younger cohorts are now picked up in the surveys. So we're really seeing a growth amongst that 18 to 25 year cohort of upwards of 25% may identify as non-white in different ways. That's a big change over 25 years ago in the Jewish community. So I think we're looking at a demographic trend that's likely to increase and is shaped by age. So as you go up the older age cohorts, you have fewer numbers of people who self-identify as non-white. But I think as you get younger and younger, you have both the immigration, the adoption, the intermarriage, and all of those things are sort of exacerbating those numbers in their own small ways. The growth is actually largest amongst Latino and Asian Americans, actually, as opposed to Black Americans, which is the group that I studied. So Black Americans are a smaller group of that non-white group, but also a growing part of that non-white group. Yes.
So do those, in those surveys, do they break down at all sort of what denomination of Judaism? Because there are people who identify with groups that mainstream Jews do not call Jewish.
Yeah, so these are all sort of studies of mainstream Jewry. Probably the best studies are considered the Pew studies and Brandeis University. So they tend to have large samples and statistically robust numbers. But all of their data is consistent. Where you get into debating is a question, well, how big are the numbers? Because the question is, well, how do you measure these categories? And then people can debate not only about how do you measure who's Jewish, but where do you divide the boundaries of that community? So that varies across all of these surveys, which is why some surveys show 4 million Jews and others show 6 million Jews. And so right there, if there's going to be that kind of spread within national surveys of Jews, then you know that once we start breaking those numbers down into those categories, we're going to get varying numbers. So the numbers are somewhat all over the place, but I think the Pew numbers are the most accurate, and they're pretty consistent over time. So we're seeing, from 2% to 6% to 8%. And so the numbers are growing at a consistent, but not an astronomical rate, but one that the Jewish community is certainly taking note of today. Yes.
A big reality now is, I think, more than half of Jews marry non-Jews, both directions. So the dynamics are going to change in the future. We're going to have even more difficulty in sorting things out. To the good. I think there'll be a lot more understanding about different races, religions, by the intermarriage.
And Jewish outmarriage rates have been high since the 1970s, just have been growing. And so that is another cause of this increasing diversity within. If you really want to see the diversity, actually, well, it's not what we focus on, but it's the Jewish household. So when you think about it demographically, what we see is that the Jewish households are becoming increasingly more diverse and the people in them are increasingly diverse. And so that's somewhat reflected in these survey data, depending on how you draw the boundaries of where you cut off the core Jewish population versus everybody else.
Correct me if I'm wrong, might be wrong. It sounds to me that the Jewish community you described, becoming increasingly diverse, in part due to intermarriage, in part due to immigration, is very similar to the diversity and the increasing diversity of the Latino community, with increasing intermarriage, increasing immigration.
Yes.
Very similar sort of dynamics.
Yes, very, very much so. And even complete with the Western trend towards more diversity in the West and in the East. So yeah, all the above, that's true. Bruce Phillips at Hebrew Union has written about Midwestern Jewish populations, and they tend to be more diverse in the South and in the West than in the rest of the country. Yes.
Yeah, so like the recent controversies surrounding celebrities like Kanye.
I knew we had to get to that sooner or later. Okay, it's great.
Well, what I was curious about is the responses indicate that there's some groups of African Americans, particularly descendants of slaves, who harbor like animosity or resentment towards Jews. And I was wondering if that was more because they're seen as white oppressors, or is because there's some sort of crabs in the bucket mentality where they're a similarly heavily persecuted group that has now become successful.
I'm going to say those are both too simple to describe the reality of what's going on. There are Afro-Americans descended from Jews through slavery, and some have chosen to reclaim their Jewish identities. So you have people who refer to themselves as Hebrew Israelites, some of whom, like Professor Lewis Gordon, who they just did a feature on in the Forward just the other day, see Ashkenazi Jews as their brethren. There are other folks who are also maybe coming from a very similar background, who are influenced by both Messianic groups, influenced by Ethiopian, sort of the Ethiopian movement at the end of the 19th century that influenced Black Christianity. And so you have people who adopted Jewish practices within their Christian practices. So you have both kind of Black Messianic groups that believe in Jesus running around, as well as groups like the Commandment Keepers in New York, who often send their kids to yeshiva in the city. And so they all are considered part of some loosely defined, quote, Black Hebrew Israelite movement. That's the way the media has defined them. I've gone to great lengths to sort of say there is no Black Hebrew Israelite movement per se. It's sort of like, it would be like grouping a bunch of storefront Black churches together and saying they're all the same. That's what you have amongst these Hebrew Israelites. So they run the gamut from those who are deeply committed to Rabbinic Judaism to those who are on the hate list for the Southern Poverty Law Center for extortion and murder. And they all use the same terminology, Hebrew Israelite. So that's where it gets really confusing. So what I would say is that there are those religious groups that have leaned towards embracing anti-Semitism and also mixed Christianity with their notion of being a Hebrew Israelite. And there are other groups that do not.
I just wanted to hear someone who actually knew what they were talking about.
Yeah, thank you. No, so for example, there's Capers Finney, who's a very public individual. He has a congregation in Chicago called B'nai Zakin Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation. He is on the Chicago Board of Rabbis. He has converted his whole family to conservative Judaism, but he is also the chief rabbi of the Ethiopian Hebrew congregation that is based out of Queens, New York. So he has his foot in two different worlds. But he's very clear about his how he interprets what he's doing. And then there are others who are marching at the Capitol, for example, the group that was got caught up that went viral a couple of years ago that were yelling at the high school kids that were wearing Trump hats or whatever it was. And so they're all out there. And so that's what makes it confusing, because in some ways the media has done a disservice by partially reporting half-truths and using labels that are kind of generic but misleading, and talking about, well, the Black Hebrew Israelites, and people, oh, who are they? And then nobody knows who they're really talking about. Where there are actually groups that refer to themselves like the African Hebrew Israelites in Dimona. But again, there's a tendency to ignore what the groups actually call themselves and just label them with these kind of pejorative labels of Black Hebrew Israelite. That's a great question. And let me speak to the broader question, I think, which is really what you're after, which is, is there Black anti-Semitism in the Black community? And in my book, I wrote very clearly about the idea that anti-Semitism is not something uniquely Black, that's something that's distinctly American, and we can all kind of draw on it. At the same time, I do raise questions about the effectiveness of what we teach our kids in our schools. And I think back to the incident of Schindler's List that happened back in LA many moons ago. Some of you may not remember it, but there was a group of high school kids from a Black inner city school that were taking to see Schindler's List. In the middle of the movie, the kids were laughing, and this turned into a big kind of public controversy over why were these Black kids laughing, and didn't they understand this stuff was serious? Well, if you really look at, beneath the surface of that incident, what you really see are a bunch of inner city kids that really didn't know too much about World War II or the Holocaust. And so they were kind of being teenagers, kind of, laughing with their nervousness because they really didn't know what they were watching. And like teenagers, they poked fun at what they thought they were watching. But what it said to me was how ill-prepared those kids were, and how we have failed in teaching about both the history of World War II and the Holocaust, and how those conversations of race are related to the conversations of race that we have right here in the United States. So that the violence that we have towards Asian Americans, the violence that we have towards Black Americans, and the anti-Semitic violence that we have are all related. But we seem to have compartmentalized this conversation and see them as separate conversations. And the unifying thing, of course, is white supremacy. That's the thing that unifies all of those conversations. See that silence you get after that?
It is a somber note.
But to me, I feel that's where the conversation needs to go. I feel that rather than allowing ye to make us realize the common conversation that we should be having, it becomes a divide and conquer, and ye becomes a lightning rod between Blacks and Jews, as opposed to a basis for rallying for both groups.
Well, thank you for those remarks. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your day. Thanks, Dean Johnson.